Welcome back. So we're going to continue with has already been an extraordinary program, and we are very excited to welcome Dr. Valerie Hudson, Dr. Valerie Hudson from the Texas A&M University. She's a University Distinguished Professor and George H.W. Bush Chair and Professor of International Relations. She is a noted expert. If you take a look at her bio online, it'll take you 3 days to read. It is extraordinary. So I will just offer that she is a noted expert, an award-winning author, an influential scholar whose research on gender and security has been employed throughout foreign policy arenas. So please join me in welcoming to the stage Dr. Hudson.
Okay, will do. I'm really excited to be here. I'm grateful to Admiral Walker and to Professor Yamin, and grateful to have sort of shared the same space as the president of Kosovo. What an amazing occurrence. Well, I'm very excited to once again give kind of a strategic look at women, peace, and security. That is to say, I want to try to give you a set of lenses to see how what's going on with women affects what's going on with nation states. So let me see if the clicker works. If I point it somewhere, let me try the button. Okay, maybe it works now. Oh, fabulous, yes. All right, and I'm here representing the George H.W. Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M, where we have an actual program on women, peace, and security. So our graduate students can actually come to the Bush School and have a dedicated program on women, peace, and security. And we've had numerous Army fellows and Air Force cadets, and if there's anyone from the Navy that would like to get a graduate degree emphasizing women, peace, and security, you know who to talk to. It's me. All right, let's see here. All right, wonderful. Today I'm going to be discussing the major themes of a book that I wrote a few years ago with several of my co-authors called The First Political Order: How Sex Shapes Governance and National Security Worldwide. So it's a big book, so I'm abridging it down and would be delighted if we have time to take questions from you to clarify anything that might be unclear. All right, so one of our first assertions, which is not new by any means, is that the first political order in any society is actually the order created between the two halves of humanity. This is a thought that goes back, hundreds of years, in that you could think of it almost as a video game. Right? If I gave you parameters to make a video game, and I said the only constraints I'm going to give you is there has to be two groups, and if they don't cooperate, there's no next round. It's all over. You would start to ask me questions about these two groups, wouldn't you? And some of the questions you would ask me are highly political in nature. That is, do these two groups stand before each other as equals, or as superiors and inferiors? When decisions are made for the group, are these decisions made by both halves of humanity or only by one half? If there are conflicts between the interests of the two groups, how are those conflicts resolved? Are they resolved by coercion and force or by compromise? And lastly, of course, the queen of political questions is what about the distribution of valuable resources, whether it be land or cattle or gold? Are those distributed equally between the two groups or not? So those are all very political questions, aren't they? And so how every society decides the answers to those questions is going to create the first political order. And you could imagine a spectrum along which we could array nation states depending upon the answers to their questions. And that's indeed where we're going with this. Let's see. I'm not sure where I'm supposed to be pointing this. There we go. Okay, good. So what if we were interested in actually seeing the first political order in a society? Well, when I first started my research, I thought, well, I'll just look at the typical indicators. I'm going to look at, say, female literacy rates, or I'll look at female labor force participation, or perhaps political representation of women in legislatures. But what I discovered is that those things don't necessarily correlate with women's situation in society. So for example, some of the very highest female literacy rates can be found in places such as Saudi Arabia. Female labor force participation is extremely high in, say, the Philippines. And the highest political representation of women in national legislatures is to be found in Rwanda. So there was kind of a mismatch there between what we might consider to be an equitable first political order and who is coming out really good on these types of indicators. So it was a conversation that happened almost 15 years ago now that really focused my attention on a different set of indicators. At my university, we were actually hosting some of the first Afghan members of the Loya Jirga. Some of you may remember that the United States imposed a quota for representation of women in the Loya Jirga of Afghanistan at 25%. It was really kind of ironic because at the time, we did not have 25% representation of women in the US Congress. So for a few years, we had more women proportionally in the Afghan legislature than we did in the legislature of the United States of America. Nevertheless, these first women, a group of them were touring the United States, and they came to our university, and I was assigned to be sort of the hostess for one of them, particularly at lunch. And being one of those introverted academic types, I was like, chit-chat. I don't know how to do chit-chat. What am I going to do? So I, being very, naive about these things, I said, oh, here you are, isn't it wonderful? You're a trained pediatrician, you've been to university, and now you're a member of the Loya Jirga. Things are going so well for women in Afghanistan. And she got this look on her face, and I knew I'd blown it. And she said, Valerie, you just don't understand. She said, I could go home today, and if my husband said, I divorce you 3 times, I would be divorced. And I would not have custody of my children because in Afghanistan, custody of the children is the right of the father. And if my husband divorced me, I would have nowhere to live because my father's family would not take me in for the shame of it. And you cannot live as a single woman in Afghanistan. And she said, even if my husband doesn't divorce me, I may have very little say in who my children marry or at what ages they marry. So she said, how empowered am I really, Valerie? And that led to a whole bunch of light bulbs going on over my head. And I said to myself, so what I really need to be looking at is not indicators like literacy rate or labor force participation or even parliamentary representation. What I really need to be looking at is the first political order within the household itself. And if I did, I would be asking a whole different array of questions. I would be asking questions that would include how much say does a woman have about getting married? How old is she when she's married, typically? And how much say does she have after she's been married? What types of property and inheritance rights do women have? Are there inequities in family law, such as inequities in divorce law or custody law, like this female MP from Afghanistan was discussing? Is marriage patrilocal, where the bride moves away from her family and to the husband's family's land? Are bride price or dowry paid? Is polygyny or cousin marriage prevalent? Does the society view domestic violence and femicide as normal, even expected, sometimes even obligatory? Is rape treated as a property crime against the guardian of the woman, either usually her father or her husband? Right? These are where you get to see the first political order in a society. So my co-authors and I hypothesized that we could actually look at various practices that subordinated the interests of women to the interests of men in society. And these practices are ones that may be familiar, some unfamiliar to you. So in the top left-hand corner there, we absolutely need to look at the levels of violence against women in a society to know what type of first political order we're dealing with. And then we would go on to look at resource control. Who controls the valuable resources in the society? We would look out also at marriage customs. We would look at patrilineality, whether the family is viewed as the male line, grandfather, father, son, grandson. Is that what the family is? And are women, in essence, kind of sent away as outsiders to the family? Cousin marriage, we would look at that. We would look at son preference. If stronger the patrilineality you have, the stronger the patrilocality you have, the stronger is the preference for sons. And what accompanies it is a general lack of investment in the lives of women and girls, which gets you to a lower age of marriage for girls because you're feeding and clothing and taking care of someone who's not really part of your family. Deep inequity in family law and customs often results. And some of you have worked in places where the actual official law is very much at odds with the customary law, the law of a particular religious group or a particular ethnic group or a particular clan or tribal group within the society. Coming up the left-hand side there, you tend to see two different types of practices depending upon whether women's productive labor is valued in the society. If it is, then you're liable to see a bride price / polygyny society where the groom must pay the bride's father to contract a marriage, and rich men can accumulate wives and greater wealth in that way. If women's labor is not considered valuable, then what you usually get is a dowry society that also includes probably sex ratio alterations. Dowry meaning that the bride's family, the bride's father, has to pay a price to the groom's family to take the burdensome bride off their hands. And of course, who wants to have to pay for multiple daughters to marry? And so you see a rise in female infanticide and sex-selective abortion. All right, so we call this kind of the syndrome, if you will, that hangs together like a set of magnetic beads, right? And the more you have, the tighter the straitjacket is. And what we're here to say is that this systematic and direct and indirect subordination of women is actually a monster. Whoops, get my monster back. It's actually a monster that eats societies, not just the women of the societies, but also their children, also the men in the societies as well as the whole society as a collective, okay? It strangles societies and prevents them from reaching stability, peace, resilience, prosperity, you name it. And that's where we're going to see this link that I've been talking about here. There we go. So you might ask yourself, Professor Hudson, what does subordinating women have to do with national security? And I've been asked that a lot. So let me try to explain it to you. Okay? Most physical groups or most human collectives decide that physical security from outgroup threats is best provided by male-bonded coalitions. Okay, if you think about that, you'll realize that that is the story of human history, is that the collective, in a sense, sources its security from these male-bonded groups. ethnic groups, tribal groups, clan groups, religious groups. And that the interests of these male coalitions must be strictly privileged above the interests of women. Furthermore, male coalitions are strengthened by the subordination of women in other ways. So, for example, women are, female labor is provided to men. Females cannot divert resources away from males because of their subordinative status. Even when a male coalition member is low status, they're always higher status than the females in society. Can use that to dominate their households. And male coalitional bonds can be cemented by marriage to each other's female kin. But what I'm here to tell you is that the syndrome is really a trap. It looks like it works, right? You've got a male bonded kin group that's going to deal with your outgroup threats. But in reality, it works to subvert the entire society itself. So you can recognize how powerful these male kin groups are in society by looking to see how many of those magnetic beads you have. But that type of security provision is actually a trap for the entire society. Governance by extended male kin networks leads to unfortunate outcomes for the entire group. Instability, violence, terror, corruption, and autocracy, because it is built upon the same characteristics at the level of the first political order, to wit, domestic instability, domestic violence, domestic terror, domestic corruption, and domestic autocracy. The kind of political order that you've built at the household level is going to bleed out into the entire society and destabilize it. Furthermore, anything that women are sort of in charge of in terms of gendered tasks will also receive less attention by the society. So in many societies, most societies, women are in charge of the health of the family. But as you subordinate and disempower women, you're liable to get then less investment in that type of gendered task. And so the health of the society is usually compromised. Food security. Women are often tasked with providing food security for the women and children of the household. As you disempower and subordinate women, you're going to get less attention to food security, leading to food insecurity. And we could go on, and we will. But in other words, before we move forward from this more theoretical part, I want to sort of suggest that the takeaway from this theoretical framework of the first political order is that what you do to your women, you do to your nation state. And if you make your women insecure, your nation will be insecure as well, because women are weaving, if you will, the foundation of stability within your society, and you have subordinated them and marginalized their views. All right, so where do we find more of these practices? We were very, very grateful for the support of the U.S. Department of Defense, who through their Minerva Initiative grant program did grant us $1.5 million to see if there was any empirical evidence that supported this notion that what's going on with women has direct effects and indirect effects on national security outcomes. So we operationalized, that is, we went out and we found all the data for that circular syndrome and its practices there. None of this will surprise you. We found more of the subordinate practices in areas such as sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. Though the dark green nations have fewer of those systematic mechanisms for subordinating women, you can still find places such as the United States where violence against women is high. So don't take those green nations as being, totally good. They're not. Absolutely not. So what is it that we begin seeing when we look at the syndrome and its effects? Sometimes the links are immediate and proximate and known to everyone in the society. And a really great case in point is bride price, which you remember is the groom's family paying the bride's family to contract a marriage. Well, bride price has been observed to become almost a flat tax on young men in the society. Except at the very elite levels, there will be a going rate for a bride within the society. But every father is looking at every other father to see if the bride price is going to rise. And then they'll raise their bride price, and so forth and so on, etc. So bride price is subject to dramatic, often swift, inflationary pressure. Societies actually try to tamp down, governments try to tamp down bride price, but it's very, very difficult to do that over time. So surging bride price is also linked to increased prevalence of polygyny, which is also a destabilizing factor in most societies. And as bride price rises, it is only rich men who are able to marry. So you begin to get a deep sense of grievance among young men as the result of bride price. And this significantly delays or even precludes marriage for many men. And so in many countries where bride price is the rule, you'll find men who cannot marry until their mid-30s. And the brides, of course, are often a decade or younger than that when they're married. Now, the link to national security is that rebel and terrorist groups notice this deep sense of grievance that has been caused by inflationary bride price. And so in truly rational form, they say, come to us, join us. And if you join us, we'll either get you the bride price or we'll get you a bride, right? We can do this if you join us. Okay, good. This was one of the unseen parts of the Boko Haram crisis. I say unseen, but it was clearly seen in Nigeria. The people who weren't picking it up were Westerners who didn't understand the link between bride price and instability and recruitment into terror and rebel groups. So there was a huge jump in bride price in northern Nigeria in the 2000s, and Boko Haram explicitly used this as a recruiting mechanism. When the schoolgirls were abducted, what was very interesting and not noticed in the Western press is that there would always be a token bride price left behind on the ground. Okay? One young lady explained the linkage between bride price and her own kidnapping. She said, in this crisis, these men can take a wife at no extra charge. Usually it's very expensive to take a wife, very hard to get married, but not now. So this linkage between inflationary bride price, which is a subordinated practice for women, and terror and rebel group recruitment has been seen in a variety of cultures. So far I've counted that there's been case studies of South Sudan, Pakistan, Timor-Leste, and a recent one looking at Somalia as well. I had my own interesting story about bride price is when my co-authored article on bride price and terrorism first came out in 2017. About 2 months later, I got an email from someone I didn't even know that was with the State Department in Kabul at the time, because of course the Americans were still in Afghanistan at that time. And the email actually started out, you don't know who I am, but I feel really stupid now. I was like, oh, this is going to be a very interesting email. What is this about? And the person said, not 2 months ago, we had a delegation come up from, and they described this border town by the land of the Pashtuns. And they said the village elders came to see us, and they insisted that the State Department do something about the rising cost of weddings. And I was like, oh, well. and proceeded to say, it's bad in America too. These kids today, they want the doves, they want the honeymoon, to the Caribbean. They want limos, it's just so bad. And I was truly puzzled why they would think that the State Department would be interested in wedding costs. He said, now I've read your article, and now I see what they were trying to tell me. They were trying to tell me that wedding costs were getting so high that their young men were going to join the Taliban for the fighting season in order to make enough money to pay the bride price. And the State Department should be aware of it and should try to do something about it. I did not understand that at all. He said, I feel very stupid now. But do you see how situational awareness is severely compromised when you don't understand these linkages? I think that's a very important part of women, peace, and security. Not simply the participation of women, but what is it that women know, and men know also, in these societies that we're not seeing, because it has to do with things like marriage customs, right? What has that got to do with national security? Well, a lot, it turns out. Sometimes the links are longer term and structural. And a really great example here is the altered sex ratios of the globe, in fact. In a natural population that hasn't had any interventions, you're liable to see an overall sex ratio of 98 men per 100 women because women tend to live longer than men. In 1990, when I first studied the issue of sex ratios and security, we only had 5 countries that had abnormal birth sex ratios, and 2 of them were Hong Kong and Macau that then subsequently reverted to Chinese control. But by the time you get to now, there's actually quite a few. There's like 18 nations, not just in Asia, but also in other parts of the world that have severely abnormal birth sex ratios. For example, you'll see not just Afghanistan, but Albania, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, others, Kosovo, Montenegro, Nepal, North Macedonia, Pakistan, Papua New Guinea, the Philippines, Samoa, Serbia, Taiwan, and Vietnam has the worst birth sex ratios of any country in the world now. Okay? So this practice that you would think to be antiquated and certainly not part of the 21st century has actually been growing across the world during this century. And sometimes migration flows drastically alter sex ratios with real national security consequences. The poster child here is Sweden. You may recall when the first huge wave of refugees came in 2015 to Europe, the various European nations did completely different things. Hungary completely closed their border and said, nobody's getting in at all. Germany took stock and said, well, we're going to take about 1 million. But Sweden, God bless Sweden, said, anybody who manages to get overland to Sweden is welcome to come. And if you happen to be under 18, we will never deport you for any reason whatsoever. Well, you can imagine what happened with Sweden, okay? Is many people tried to get to Sweden, 85% of whom were young adult males. And as many as could, even unreasonably, claimed to be 16 and 17 years old, even when they were obviously not 16 and 17 years old. And what happened is when Sweden counted noses in 2016, they found to their horror that the sex ratio among Swedish 16 and 17-year-olds was now worse than China's. That is, in Sweden, it was 123 male 16 and 17-year-olds for every 100 female 16 and 17-year-olds. China's ratio was only 117 to 100. So they had absolutely upended the sex ratio in dramatic ways as a result of their migration policy. Did that have national security effects? Well, you bet it had national security effects. I don't know if any of you have been following the Swedish case, but the Sweden used to have one of the lowest crime rates in all of Europe. It now has the highest crime rate in all of Europe, including the highest bombing rate in Europe. So what we see in highly masculinized sex ratio societies is crime rates and political protest rates increase dramatically. There's marriage market obstruction, so you get obviously larger bride prices in such societies. Crimes against women increase dramatically, including trafficking and forced prostitution, but also public sexual harassment of women, which has been a real scourge among Swedish women lately, so resulting in mobility restriction. You get greater HIV and STD spread, and also perhaps you get an altered calculus of deterrence. Think of China for just a moment. China now has 50 million more young adult men than young adult women. Those 50 million men have no hope of getting married and starting a family, being, a branch of their family patrilineal. It causes deep, deep grievance. But what's interesting to me as a national security scholar is when you think of what the worst case war scenario is, absent weapons of mass destruction, you think of a war of attrition, don't you? No nation wants a war of attrition. It is going to be incredibly politically unpopular, and it will be just a horror, right, for the leaders as well as for those commanding on the ground. Wars of attrition are to be avoided at all costs. But what happens if you have tens of millions of very disenchanted young men, and what happens to your calculation, your cost-benefit calculation of a war of attrition? Maybe a war of attrition doesn't look quite as disadvantageous to a highly masculinized sex ratio society as it does with a normal sex ratio society. So can sex ratio alter the calculus of deterrence? Are we even thinking about that? It's an interesting question. All right, so I'd like to deal now with the empirical evidence. Are high syndrome scores, that is, societies that are much more subordinative of women, all right, is that associated with worse outcomes for nation states, holding other important variables constant? That's what DoD was really paying for, and so that's what we wanted to give them. There we go. Okay, wonderful. So we took our 4-year Minerva grant and we operationalized all those things that you see there: level of violence against women, degree of polygyny, cousin marriage, discriminatory family law, you name it. We looked at everything in that diagram. We looked for the first political order. And in addition to that, since we had, only one time period in which we were looking at the first political order, we settled on a cross-sectional analysis using multivariate regression, holding 7 variables constant. And because we wanted to make sure that our research was not dismissed as squishy social science, we decided to put our level of significance at 0.001 instead of the usual 0.01. If any of you are familiar with statistics, you'll know what I'm talking about. And we looked at clusters of variables for these 9 different dimensions of national security. So we looked at political stability and governance, security and conflict, economic performance, rentierism, health and well-being, demographic security, education, social progress, and even environmental protection. All right, you can't read this slide, but that's okay. We were also very aware that people could say to us, well, You know, if you'd measured economic prosperity in this way rather than this variable, you would have found something totally different. So we decided that we were going to take as many different permutations, as many different slices or looks at these 9 dimensions of national security as we possibly could. So I think we wound up with something like, 161 outcome variables. Our statistician forced us to use factor analysis to reduce it to 122. Yeah, we were okay with that. And so, all right, we used the syndrome as well as several other variables, such as, level of urbanization and other things, and then looked at all of these outcome variables. And we were asking ourselves, would the syndrome come out, number one, as significant at the 0.001 level? And number two, what would be the effect size? Would it be highly determinative or would it be less determinative in our multiple regression equations? All right, 24 measures of political instability, freedom, autocracy, corruption, you name it, all those types of variables. 100% of the model runs showed that the syndrome was significant and was either the largest effect size in the equation or the second largest effect size. Conflict and insecurity, about 70% of the time. Terror, 100% of the time. Economic performance, 62.5%. Economic rentierism, 50%. Public health and well-being, about 71%. Environmental preservation, I was pretty shocked at this, 85.7% of the model runs. Demographic security, 85.7 as well. Educational attainment, 60%. Social progress, 75%. All right, across all the model runs then, all 122 regression equations, we found that in 73.8% of them, how much you subordinate women was not only highly significant, but highly determinative of the outcomes. Just pause for a minute and think about that. Do you know of any other variable that would do the same? The subordination of women is, in fact, one of the largest predictors of how your nation state will fare across the board, across the entire globe. It's really quite amazing. If you're interested more in odds ratios, all right, we also ran logistic regressions. So for every step worse that you subordinate women, you will be almost twice the odds of being a fragile state, over twice the times, the chance of having a government that's more autocratic, less effective, and more corrupt. About 1.4 times the chance of being unstable and violent. 1.5 times the chance of experiencing terrorism, and so on and so forth. You know, almost 1.8 times the chance of being food insecure. That's for each step, each additional step you take to subordinate women. It's almost as if it were an iron law of social science. I love what Rose McDermott had to say about our findings. She says, the findings are clear, consistent, and statistically robust across the board. In fact, the results are the kind of thing most social scientists strive for but almost never find in the course of their careers. If these findings were about something not related to women, chances are they would be treated as revolutionary in international relations theory. Indeed, the effects are much stronger than those supporting the notion of the democratic peace that has spawned an entire cottage industry of inquiry. She said, "I leave it to the reader to ponder why powerful effects regarding the treatment of women on the health and security of states do not receive such extensive attention." Very good point. Why do we get these? Well, I think there's at least 3 causal pathways that we're looking at. Number 1, boot camp. The first political order is a boot camp, if you will, for how to build a society. So there's no better training camp for political violence and instability than lived domestic terror perpetration, lived domestic corruption and exploitation, lived domestic autocracy, okay? Secondly, their subordination of women creates chronic structural goads to instability. It's like taking a 3-legged stool and sawing off one of the legs. It will always be unstable, no matter what you try to do. Bride price, polygyny, altered sex ratios in favor of males, for example. You cannot have a stable society and have these things prevalent in your society. It just doesn't work that way. And lastly, you're disempowering women. You're disempowering the very persons who would have a different perspective on this matter, a different cost-benefit calculation, right? So you're muting them. So in all these ways, what you do to your women, you do to your nation state, right? If you subordinate and make your women insecure, you will make your nation state insecure. So in light of these empirical findings, are you, out here in the audience, are you a realist if you acknowledge the link between what's going on with women and the security situation of nations? Right? Are you a realist if you think there might be something to WPS that augments security, right? That it's not simply some politically correct harebrained scheme coming out of, the Pentagon or something of that, right? What, perhaps more importantly, can you call yourself a realist if you don't believe these things? If you don't believe that what's going on with women has anything to do with security? Or if you don't believe that sitting here today in the auditorium listening about women, peace, and security is a waste of your time, right? Something to think about. So what changes when we become realists, real realists? Okay, I think there's a number of things. If the U.S. is not tracking the situation of women, all right, how can it expect to have an effective foreign policy? What happens to situational awareness when you don't see the kind of linkages that we've been talking about today? How will it gauge the strength of deterrence if it doesn't understand the linkages that we've discussed? Okay. When the U.S. is faced with supporting or refusing to support subnational actors that are vying for national power in another land, the first question out of their mouths or in their heads should be, how do these groups intend to treat women? Because if you're betting on the horse that intends to subordinate women, you are betting on the forces of chaos and instability. Okay? That's important. But who's raising that? Who raised that at the table when we decided to arm the Mujahideen in Afghanistan? Well, nobody raised that question. And I'd like to know who's going to raise that question now with regard to Syria. Okay? These choices matter. How about avoiding the trap of peace negotiations where the rights of women are bargained away or not even considered so that you can make peace among the warlords? Okay? We've seen that peace before, haven't we? We've seen it in Afghanistan. We've seen it in Iraq. And we know that it does not bode well for the stability and security of the nation state. How would the U.S. track which of its citizens, which of its own citizens, are the greatest internal threat if domestic violence is not seen as a form of domestic terror? I think some of you are aware that the U.S. Secret Service penned a report 2 years ago that said that one of the most highly predictive indicators of whether someone would use political violence is whether they had ever been arrested for domestic violence against a spouse or an ex-spouse, girlfriend, ex-girlfriend, mother, sister, daughter, okay? Much more likely to commit political violence because it's the boot camp, isn't it? The boot camp for political violence is domestic violence. It's a form of domestic terror, right? And I think slowly, given the Secret Service report as an example, we're seeing that dawn on people, that misogyny goes hand in hand with terror and political violence. Okay? Immigration policy, right? How do we rationally look at immigration policy if we're not interested in things besides religion and ethnicity? What we should be interested in is neither of those things, but rather the treatment of women, okay? And tolerating enclaves of subordinative practices against women has turned out to be a real trap for many different nations, and they've seen instability explode as a result. How will the U.S. know that ending child marriage worldwide probably would do more to secure the peace than the exportation of democracy? I'm willing to engage that debate because I have the data on hand that shows that ending child marriage is transformative in a way that importing ballot boxes is not. Likewise, this relates to the question of how the U.S. will know when exporting democracy makes sense and when it doesn't, right? If you're building upon a first political order that is autocratic, how do you really expect to import a meaningful democracy? I believe that one day, the idea that foreign policy, national security policy could ignore the situation of women will be seen as laughably naive. And I think that's one of the reasons why the Naval War College has mandated that you be here today, right? Is they don't want you to be naive. They want you to see what other people don't. They want you to see the linkages, notice things that you would never have noticed before, ask questions you would never have asked before. Given the many outcome dimensions examined, I think it's fair to say that women's insecurity profoundly and significantly undermines state security. My very favorite quote on the matter comes from former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton back in 2012, when she said, "The subjugation of women is a threat to the common security of our world and the national security of our country. And disrupting the weak points of that syndrome may be foundational to end conflict, ensure effective governance, and promote peace." And I think only by adopting WPS lenses, as we are doing so here today, can we see these linkages, which can only make our foreign and security policies more effective. And to end, remember, what you do to your women, you do to your nation state. Afflict your women, make them insecure, and your own nation will be afflicted and insecure. Thank you so very much, and if you're interested in the data upon which this analysis was made, go to womenstats.org and you can find it. Thank you again. Sorry, there was no time for questions. No problem.
Thank you very much. It is clear that you're a professor. Thank you for helping us learn, and thank you very much for sharing data that connects the situation of women to our national security.